I never expected that a plumbing disaster in my apartment building would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. For most of my 26 years, my life had been a carefully curated collection of routines. It was quiet, it was predictable, and, if I was being honest with myself, it was a little lonely. But it was safe. Safety was a currency I had come to value above almost all else. My name is Miles, and I'm a graphic designer. For years, that meant a commute, an office cubicle, and polite chit-chat over the whir of the coffee machine. But after the world shifted, my company, like many others, discovered that productivity didn't plummet when we worked from our living rooms. So, what started as a temporary measure became permanent. My small, one-bedroom apartment transformed into my entire world, my office, my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude. It was a nice enough place. An older building with good bones and what real estate agents optimistically call character, which is code for slightly uneven floors and walls that are a little too thin. I'd furnished it with a minimalist eye, all clean lines and muted colors. It was a space designed for focus and calm, a reflection of the life I was trying to lead. I had my work, my books, my streaming services, and a perfectly calibrated pour-over coffee routine. It was enough. Or so I told myself. Then there was Caleb. He lived in the apartment directly below mine, 2B to my 3B. I didn't know him, not really, but I knew the sounds of his life. I knew the heavy tread of his work boots on the hardwood floors around 7 in the morning and again around 6 at night. I knew the low, indistinct rumble of his television when he watched action movies. On weekends, I sometimes heard the gentle, rhythmic scrape of sandpaper against wood, a sound I found surprisingly soothing. In person, he was just as much of an enigma, a collection of brief impressions. I'd see him at the mailboxes or holding the lobby door open. He was tall, with the kind of broad shoulders that came from physical work, not a gym. His hair was a dark, unruly brown that he was always pushing out of his eyes, and he had a dusting of stubble that seemed permanently fixed between clean-shaven and a full beard. He always offered a quick, friendly smile and a nod, but his eyes would slide past mine, never really landing. In my head, I had written a complete biography for him. He was definitively, unequivocally straight. He probably had a girlfriend who was beautiful and laughed at all his jokes. He likely spent his weekends watching sports with his buddies and drinking beer. He was a character from a different world, a world I observed from a safe distance. He was, in short, completely and utterly unattainable. And because of that, I kept my own interactions with him just as brief, just as polite. It was a defense mechanism, a way to keep the quiet ache of longing from becoming too loud. My perception of him was a fortress as carefully constructed as my quiet life. I saw him as a type, a symbol of a life I wasn't part of. He was confident, self-assured, grounded in a physical reality of construction and hard labor that felt worlds away from my digital existence of pixels and vectors. I would sometimes see him carrying lumber or tools into the building, his arms dusted with sawdust, and a pang of something I couldn't name would hit me. It wasn't just attraction, it was a kind of fascination with his tangible, solid presence in the world. This went on for the better part of a year. Our lives ran on parallel tracks, separated by a few inches of plaster and floorboards. I would hear the sounds of his life below, and I'd wonder, what was he watching? What was he building? Who was he talking to on the phone when his voice became a low, happy murmur? They were idle questions, the kind you ask yourself when you're alone and the city sounds have died down. I never expected to get any answers. Life, I had learned, rarely offers up the answers to the questions you're too afraid to ask out loud. The day it all changed started with a smell, a damp, musty odor that I couldn't place. I checked for old food in the fridge, sniffed the dish rag in the sink, even took out the trash. But it lingered, growing stronger throughout the afternoon. Then I noticed the corner of my living room carpet was dark, almost black, and squelched when I stepped on it. My blood ran cold. I called the building's superintendent, Mr. Henderson, a perpetually tired man who always seemed annoyed to be doing his job. He arrived an hour later, took one look at the damp spot, and let out a long, weary sigh. He disappeared into the utility closet in the hall and returned with a large wrench. The problem, he declared after a few minutes of investigation, was a burst pipe in the wall. Not just any pipe, but a main water line. "It's going to be a mess," he grumbled, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Gotta shut off the water to the whole line." Gonna have to tear out part of this wall, and probably the ceiling in the unit below. The unit below. Caleb's unit. My stomach clenched. As if on cue, a frantic knocking echoed from my front door. I opened it to find Caleb standing there, his expression a mixture of panic and disbelief. His hair was damp, and there were dark patches on his t-shirt. Hey, sorry to bother you, he started, his voice strained. Is your water doing something crazy? My ceiling is, well, it's currently becoming my floor. Before I could answer, Mr. Henderson chimed in from the living room. Yeah, it's a burst pipe in the wall between floors. Big job. You're both going to have some damage. He looked from me to Caleb, his expression devoid of sympathy. And you, he said, pointing his wrench at Caleb. Your place is going to be unlivable for a bit. We got to pull down the whole ceiling, dry everything out, run industrial fans. It'll be a construction zone for at least a week, maybe more. I watched Caleb's face fall. The easy confidence I always saw in him evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. He ran a hand through his damp hair, looking utterly lost. A week? Where am I supposed to go? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. He looked around the hallway, at the peeling paint and worn-out carpet, as if the solution might magically appear there. My heart, the one I kept so carefully guarded, gave a painful lurch. And then, words started coming out of my mouth that I hadn't planned. They bypassed my brain entirely, emerging directly from that sudden, aching swell of empathy in my chest. You can stay with me, I heard myself say. The moment the words were out, a wave of panic washed over me. What was I doing? Inviting my unattainable crush, the subject of 1,000 private daydreams, to live in my carefully controlled space? It was insane. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes wide. What? No, I couldn't. I can't ask you to do that. We barely know each other, he shook his head, but there was a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes that twisted my gut. It's no problem, I insisted, my voice sounding much calmer than I felt. I have a spare room. It's small, mostly used for storage, but it has a bed. It's better than a hotel, and honestly, it's the least I can do. The leak started closer to my floor, anyway. I feel kind of responsible. It was a ridiculous thing to say, but it was the only justification I could grasp onto. He hesitated for a long moment, his gaze searching mine. I think he was looking for any sign of reluctance, any hint that I was just being polite. I tried to keep my expression open and sincere, a silent battle against the frantic screaming inside my own head. Are you sure? He asked, his voice soft. It would be a huge help. I'm sure, I said, and I managed a small, reassuring smile. It's settled. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an eternity. The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. Thank you, he said, and the gratitude in his voice was so genuine it silenced all my second thoughts. Seriously, Miles. Thank you, he used my name. I realized I had never actually heard him say my name before. It sounded different than I had imagined. It sounded real. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in awkwardness. My carefully ordered world was immediately thrown into chaos. Caleb moved in with just a duffel bag and a backpack, but his presence seemed to fill every corner of my small apartment. His work boots by the door looked enormous next to my sneakers. His scent, a mix of sawdust, soap, and something uniquely him, lingered in the air after he walked through a room. We navigated the shared space like two hesitant dancers learning a new and complicated routine. We bumped into each other in the narrow hallway. We reached for the same milk carton in the fridge. We had a stilted conversation about who got to use the shower first in the morning. I was so wound up, so hyper-aware of him, that I felt like a single exposed nerve. I tried to act casual, to pretend that having this incredibly handsome man suddenly living with me was the most normal thing in the world. I'm fairly certain I failed spectacularly. Caleb, for his part, seemed determined to be the perfect house guest. He was meticulously clean, wiping down the counter after making a sandwich, rinsing his dishes immediately. He was quiet, often retreating to the spare room to make phone calls to his insurance company or the landlord. He kept thanking me, over and over, until I finally had to tell him to stop. Seriously, it's fine, I said, trying for a laugh. You can pay me back by not mentioning it again for at least an hour. That earned me a genuine, unforced smile, and the tension eased, just a little. The shift happened on the third night. I was working late on a project, staring intently at my screen as I adjusted the kerning on a new logo. I was so focused I didn't hear him come up behind me. "That's cool," his voice said, low and close to my ear. I jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Sorry," he said, backing up a step. "Didn't mean to startle you. I was just, what is all that?" I swiveled in my chair, trying to slow my breathing. "Oh, it's just work. I'm a graphic designer." I expected him to nod, say cool, and walk away. That's what most people did. My job was abstract, hard to explain to people who didn't work in a creative field. But Caleb didn't walk away. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the back of my chair, his gaze fixed on the screen. "So you, draw logos and stuff?" he asked. There was no judgment in his voice, only genuine curiosity. It was the first time he'd asked me anything personal. "Sometimes," I explained, feeling a strange urge to make him understand. "This is more about typography. Choosing the right font, adjusting the space between the letters to make it feel balanced. It's kind of like architecture, but with letters." The comparison felt clumsy as soon as I said it. He was quiet for a moment, and I was sure I'd lost him. But then he said, "No, I get that. It's like joinery and woodworking. You can have two perfect pieces of wood, but if the joint isn't clean, if the fit isn't exactly right, the whole piece feels off. No one might know exactly why it looks wrong, but they can feel it." I stared at him. It was the perfect analogy. He had taken my abstract world of pixels and found a parallel in his own tangible world of wood and grain. For the first time, the person I saw wasn't the one-dimensional, confident jock I had invented. It was someone thoughtful, someone who understood the nuances of a craft. It was the first real crack in the fortress of my assumptions. "Exactly," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "That's exactly what it's like." We stayed like that for a moment, him leaning over my chair, both of us looking at the screen, a comfortable silence settling between us. It was the first time since he'd moved in that my awareness of him wasn't fueled by anxiety, but by a spark of genuine connection. The next morning, that spark was still there. I woke up to the smell of coffee. Not my coffee, not the carefully measured beans and precise pour-over ritual I performed every day. It was the rich, dark aroma of a drip coffee maker. I walked into the kitchen to find Caleb standing by the counter, a mug in his hand, another one sitting waiting for me. "Morning," he said, pushing the mug toward me. Figured it was the least I could do. Hope you don't mind. I used the coffee maker in the back of the cabinet. Your pour-over thing looked way too complicated for me." I took the mug, my fingers brushing against his for a fraction of a second. The brief touch sent a jolt straight through me. "Thanks," I mumbled, trying to hide the effect it had on me. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said simply. He held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, a small, unreadable smile on his lips. I took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, a little bitter, completely different from how I usually made it. And it was one of the best cups of coffee I'd ever had. It was a small gesture, just a cup of coffee. But it felt significant. It felt like care. It was another small chip in the wall I'd built around him and around myself. That wall, it was starting to seem, was much less sturdy than I had believed. The next couple of days saw a new rhythm establish itself. The initial awkwardness had melted away, replaced by a comfortable, lived-in silence. We fell into a domestic routine that felt surprisingly natural. We'd have coffee in the mornings, talk about our days in the evenings. I learned that he worked for a large construction company, but his real passion was making custom furniture. He showed me pictures on his phone of beautifully crafted tables and chairs, his eyes lighting up as he talked about the grain of the wood, the challenge of a difficult design. In return, I found myself opening up in ways I never did with anyone. I showed him my portfolio, explaining the thought process behind different branding projects. He listened with an intensity that made me feel seen. He didn't just see the finished product. He saw the work, the thought, the passion that went into it. The Caleb I was getting to know was nothing like the one I had invented. He was quieter, more thoughtful, and he possessed a hidden depth that I found myself increasingly drawn to. The line between my unattainable crush and my temporary roommate was blurring into non-existence. He was just Caleb, and that was far more dangerous. The turning point came on a Saturday night. It had been raining all day, a steady, relentless downpour that drummed against the window panes and washed the city in a palette of grays. We had abandoned any pretense of having separate lives. We ordered pizza, ate it sitting on the floor in the living room, and argued good-naturedly about what movie to watch. We settled on some mindless sci-fi blockbuster, something with lots of explosions and very little plot. We started out on opposite ends of my small sofa, a respectable distance between us. But as the movie went on, the space seemed to shrink. A shared laugh would bring us leaning closer. A tense action sequence had him shifting, his knee brushing against mine. Each point of contact was like a small electric shock, lighting up my nerves. I was acutely aware of his warmth, of the sheer physical presence of him next to me. About an hour into the movie, he let out a big yawn and stretched, his arm brushing against my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I was waiting for him to pull back, to re-establish the space between us. But he didn't. Instead, he did something that made the air leave my lungs in a silent rush. He relaxed, sank down into the cushions, and laid his head in my lap. Just like that. There was no preamble, no warning. One moment he was sitting beside me. The next, the weight of his head was a solid, warm pressure on my thighs. My mind went completely blank. All my carefully constructed defenses, all my anxious internal monologues, all of it just vanished, replaced by a singular, overwhelming thought. He's resting his head in my lap. He shifted slightly, getting comfortable, as if this was the most natural thing in the world for two guys to do. As if he hadn't just shattered my entire reality. The movie played on, ignored. The sound of explosions and dramatic music was a distant hum. All I could feel was the weight of him. All I could smell was the faint scent of his shampoo. All I could see was the top of his head, his dark hair soft and messy under the dim light of the lamp. Time seemed to slow down, stretching out into an eternity. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure he could hear it. My hands were frozen, resting awkwardly at my sides. What was I supposed to do? Was this friendly? Was he just tired? Or was this something else? It felt like a test, a question being asked without words. And I had no idea how to answer. My gaze fell to my hand, and an impulse I couldn't control took over. Slowly, tentatively, I lifted it. My fingers trembled as I moved my hand toward his head. I hesitated for a split second, my hand hovering in the air above his hair, my mind screaming at me to stop, to not misread this, to not ruin everything. But my heart, that foolish, hopeful part of me, urged me on. I let my fingers brush against his hair. It was even softer than it looked. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, I felt him exhale, a soft puff of air against my leg, and he seemed to relax even further, leaning into my touch. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was permission. Emboldened, I rested my hand fully on his head, my fingers gently carding through the thick strands of his hair. It was an act of impossible intimacy. I could feel the warmth of his scalp, the steady, rhythmic pulse of his life beneath my palm. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. In the quiet of my living room, with the rain tapping against the glass, a new language was being formed between us, one made of touch and trust and the terrifying, beautiful weight of unspoken feelings. The movie ended, the credits rolled, but we didn't move. We just stayed there, on the sofa, in a silence that was more profound than any conversation we'd ever had. The next morning, the spell was broken. The comfortable quiet of the past week was gone, replaced by a thick, charged tension. It was like the air pressure had dropped before a storm. We moved around each other with a new, painful awareness. We avoided eye contact. The easy chatter over coffee was replaced by a strained silence. I made my pour over, he drank his drip coffee, and we stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island like two strangers. My mind was a chaotic mess, replaying the events of the night before on an endless loop. His head in my lap, my hand in his hair, his sigh of contentment. What did it mean? Every logical part of my brain told me not to get my hopes up. He was just tired. He was comfortable. It was a friendly, platonic gesture that I was blowing way out of proportion because of my own stupid crush. I was reading entire novels into a single, meaningless sentence. But then there was the other part of me, the hopeful, treacherous part. It clung to the memory of him leaning into my touch. It insisted that there was no way a gesture that intimate could be purely platonic. That kind of physical surrender, that vulnerability, it had to mean something, right? The two possibilities warred inside me, hope and fear locked in a brutal cage match. I felt like I was losing my mind. I kept stealing glances at him, trying to read his expression, searching for some clue, some sign that would tell me how to feel. But his face was a mask. He looked preoccupied, distant. Was he regretting it? Was he disgusted with me? Or was he just as confused and overwhelmed as I was? The not knowing was a special kind of torture. The final blow came later that afternoon. He was on the phone with Mr. Henderson. I pretended to be engrossed in my work, but I was listening to every word. Yeah, that's great news. Okay, so by tomorrow night. Perfect. Thanks for letting me know. He hung up and turned to me, that same distant expression on his face. So, good news, he said, and his voice sounded unnaturally formal. My apartment's almost done. The fans are out, and they just need to do a final coat of paint on the ceiling. I should be able to move back in tomorrow. Oh, I said. My voice was flat. That's great. It felt like a punch to the gut. This temporary, magical bubble we had been living in was about to burst. He was leaving, and this unbearable, unspoken thing between us would be left hanging in the air, unresolved. The ticking clock I hadn't even realized was there suddenly started screaming in my ears. I had less than 24 hours. 24 hours to do what? I had no idea. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. I tried to work, but the pixels on my screen swam before my eyes. Every time he moved, every time he cleared his throat, my head would snap up, my heart leaping into my throat. But the moment for a conversation never came. The silence between us grew heavier, more suffocating, with each passing hour. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of him breathing in the next room. I thought about the easy confidence I used to see in him in the hallways, and how it had been replaced by this confusing mix of vulnerability and distance. I thought about the feeling of his hair beneath my fingers, the solid weight of his head in my lap. Was I going to let him walk back down to his apartment tomorrow and pretend none of this ever happened? Was I going to go back to my safe, quiet, lonely life, haunted by the ghost of what might have been? The thought was unbearable. But the alternative, the risk of saying something and being wrong, was just as terrifying. His last evening in my apartment was agonizing. He started gathering his few belongings from the spare room, folding his clothes and packing them neatly back into his duffel bag. Each item he packed felt like a stone being placed on my chest. The boots by the door, the toothbrush from the bathroom holder, the coffee mug he'd used every morning. My apartment was already starting to feel empty, and he hadn't even left yet. The silence was deafening. We'd run out of small talk, and the big, important thing was a monstrous presence in the room that neither of us dared to acknowledge. I was sitting on the sofa, the same sofa where it had all happened, pretending to read a book, but actually just staring at the same sentence over and over again. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Say something, I screamed at myself. Say anything. He finished packing and zipped up his bag. He stood in the doorway of the living room for a moment, just looking at me. The distant, guarded expression was gone, replaced by a raw nervousness that I'd never seen on him before. He looked just as terrified as I felt. Miles, he said, his voice quiet, uncertain. Can we talk for a minute? I closed my book, my hands trembling slightly. Yeah, of course. He walked over and didn't sit at the other end of the couch, but on the coffee table, facing me. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at his hands as he spoke. Look, I know things have been weird since the other night, he started, his voice strained. And I'm sorry about that. I've been a mess. I haven't known what to say. He took a deep, shaky breath. When I rested my head on your lap, that wasn't an accident. It wasn't because I was tired. He finally lifted his head and met my gaze. His eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading vulnerability. It was a test. A really stupid, clumsy test. I had to see what you would do. I couldn't breathe. My entire world had just tilted on its axis. A test. I managed to whisper. He nodded, a humorless, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. Yeah. See, the thing is, Miles, this whole thing with my apartment, it wasn't the first time I'd thought about finding an excuse to talk to you. I've been thinking about you for months. My jaw went slack. I'd see you in the hall or getting your mail, and you just have this quiet, calm energy about you. I wanted to talk to you, to actually know you, but I never had the guts. I kept telling myself you wouldn't be interested. He let out a shaky laugh. I mean, look at me. I'm this big, clumsy guy who works in construction. And you're you. You're artistic and smart, and you have this whole world going on that I know nothing about. I figured you had me pegged as just some dumb jock. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He had been just as scared, just as insecure, just as full of wrong assumptions as I had been. We had been two idiots, standing on opposite sides of a door, both too afraid to knock. And then, he continued, his voice dropping lower, more intense. I've been here this past week. And getting to know you, actually talking to you, it's been even worse. Because the person I imagined you were doesn't even come close to how great you actually are. He finally looked me straight in the eye, all the fear and hesitation coalescing into a single point of raw honesty. I can't stop thinking about you, Miles. It is driving me crazy. And the other night, when you touched my hair, it was everything I was hoping for, and I've been freaking out ever since. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. All the anxiety, all the fear, it all just dissolved, leaving behind a clear, bright, shining truth. I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding, and a laugh bubbled up from my chest. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated joy. Caleb looked confused. What's so funny? You, I said, shaking my head in disbelief. Me. Us. I've had a massive, hopeless crush on you for almost a year. I had you pegged as the unattainable straight guy who would never in a million years look twice at me. His eyes widened, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. It was the first truly unguarded smile I'd seen from him, and it transformed him completely. All the tension left his body. You're kidding me, he breathed out. All this time, I confirmed. We just stared at each other for a moment, the shared absurdity and relief of it all hanging between us. Then, his expression shifted, becoming serious again, but a different kind of serious. It was determined. So, he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper as he leaned a little closer. Can I prove it? That I can't stop thinking about you. I didn't need words to answer. I just leaned forward, closing the small gap between us. His lips met mine, and it was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was firm and sure, and full of all the unspoken longing of the past week, the past year. It was a kiss that tasted like relief and hope and the promise of a new beginning. It was an answer. Caleb moved back to his own apartment the next day, but in reality, he never really left. His apartment downstairs became little more than a place to keep his clothes and his woodworking tools. Most of his time was spent upstairs, with me. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by the easy intimacy of a new relationship. The apartment that had once been my fortress of solitude was now our shared space, filled with laughter and conversation. We spent the next few weeks in a blissful bubble, discovering each other. I learned the difference between oak and maple, and the quiet satisfaction he got from creating something beautiful and enduring with his own two hands. He, in turn, learned about the strange, meticulous world of design, and he'd sit and watch me work for hours, fascinated by the way a project came together from nothing. Our worlds, which had once seemed so different, began to overlap and merge in the most wonderful way. We went on dates. We walked through parks, holding hands. We stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. I met his friends, who were not the beer-swilling jocks I had imagined, but a warm, funny group of people who welcomed me without question. He helped me hang a shelf in my office, his hands sure and steady where mine were clumsy. I helped him build a website to showcase his furniture, turning his passion into a potential business. We were building something together, something more important than shelves or websites. One evening, a couple of months later, we were back on the sofa, the place where everything had changed. The TV was on, but neither of us was watching. His head was in my lap again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. It was home. I was running my fingers through his hair, a familiar, comforting motion that still sent a quiet thrill through me. He tilted his head back to look up at me, a soft, contented smile on his face. You know, he said, his voice a low rumble. I'm almost glad my ceiling collapsed. I laughed, leaning down to kiss him. Almost, I asked against his lips. Only almost. I'm deeply offended. He chuckled, his arms wrapping around my neck to pull me closer. Okay, fine. I am 100%, completely, ridiculously glad my ceiling collapsed. Best disaster that ever happened to me. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the lamp in the corner of the room. I thought about my old life, the quiet, safe, orderly routine I had clung to so tightly. It was a good life, but it wasn't a full one. I had been observing the world from behind a wall of my own making, a wall of fear and assumption. It took a burst pipe to literally break down the walls between our homes, but it was his vulnerability, and then mine, that broke down the walls around our hearts. And I learned that sometimes the foundation of your life has to crack a little to let the light in. You can plan and organize and build your routines, but you can never truly account for the beautiful, chaotic, life-altering disasters. You can never plan for a leaky pipe or for the quiet, handsome man from downstairs who changes everything you thought you knew about yourself and about love. And you know what? That's the best part, isn't it?